we're going to open it up for panel discussion for your burning questions. I have a burning question. So there's a lot of scientific disciplines represented in the room, most importantly, the toxicologists. But, microbiologists, epidemiologists, nutritionists, dietitians, et cetera. And one thing Cargill's CEO likes to say is that the pace of change will never be slower than it is today. And so, the food industry, me being biased, there's a lot of change in terms of, high levels of proteins in foods, et cetera. Well, the nutritionists would say, we need to look at these alternatives that the consumers want. The toxicologist in me goes, some of these novel proteins may elicit a reaction or may have cross-reactive properties of known allergens. So, we hear cricket protein, these types of things are, novel proteins that are emerging on the market. Do we have any information that we can try and glean from the known literature to help us make responsible decisions as to whether or not we need to put those into our product and what kind of safety concerns there may be? I think, Dr. Taylor, we talked about this a little bit before the session. So I'd just like to hear your input on that.
Yeah, we do have good information, I think, more limited than for the foods I talked about. Mm-hmm. But many of these novel protein sources are well-known allergens. There's almost no such thing as a non-allergenic food. And so some of these sources are going to lead to predictable consequences. My personal favorite at the moment is pea protein because there's peanut, there's soybean, and then there's a whole range of other legumes, and they're good sources of protein. Nutritionally, they're good, but they're all allergens. Sure. And if you increase exposure, you're going to get more people with allergies. How many? That's hard to predict. Sure. But I'd be really cautious if I think if there's a company seeking a really novel allergen source, they should call us, because FDA keeps sending these folks to us, and I say, it's going to cost you $100,000 to $200,000 for us to evaluate the allergenicity of your novel protein source if there isn't any data. You need to ask FDA what they're going to do with that information before you invest the money. Mm-hmm. I'd love to take their money and do the research academically interesting, but if FDA is going to refuse to allow any of these proteins in the diet if they have any allergenic risk, then they're not going to allow any of them, so just give up to start with. They have to give some guidance, and that's what they did with the cricket flour guys. They sent them to us, and I said, your protein's going to cross-react with shrimp. We know that already. They're both invertebrates. It's predictable in advance. So are they going to then not allow cricket flour because it cross-reacts with shrimp? How are they going to allow you to label that product so consumers would know? Mm-hmm. It's a concern.
Yep. Certainly to echo that, I think the responsible part for the consumer and the medical groups as well is we would expect to know that. Nobody is going to want to be surprised.
Right.
And so I think part of the normal stewardship or due diligence would be to do that. And we have a good idea of how many people are allergic to shrimp and, with sure. Good labeling, all of that. So I don't think there's a desire to decrease novel protein, but sort of from a market advantage, there will never be something that's going to be, that will be non-allergenic in everybody at every dose.
Yep, absolutely. But if you're loading a product with protein, obviously protein is the source of or the reactant for the allergic response. And so protein is such a big topic right now in consumer circles that, if we're adding vast amounts of protein into a product, it's going to elicit allergic response because the load is so high.
Well, there's sort of two parts to that, why it'd be the next session, I think. How much protein do we need to put in things? But I really, when I closed with saying this is an emerging area, not just in science, but don't ever underestimate the enthusiasm that the advocacy groups have, that parents have who've ever lost a child or something like that. So it's much more in the public domain now. So, we have to feed the people and all of those other things.
Absolutely.
But I think it'll be an important part of your work.
Absolutely. All right, sorry to take over for the first question, but
No problem.
thank you.
Simin Meidani, Tufts University. Are there known environment gene interactions that can change the risk or genetic risk for known allergens that we know of? Or have there been studies that specifically show environmental factors that can change the genetic risk for some of these allergens, including some other foods?
So that's a really good question. It's the question, if everybody didn't hear, is are there environmental factors that can change the risk? So there's the study of genetics, as you know, has become quite complex because there's not just the genes that we have and the potential for the genes to be expressed, but there's the whole study of epigenetics. And epigenetics is things that we are exposed to in life, be they viruses, be they other toxins, be they other types of infections or foods, which modify our genes, usually by methylation, to allow for expression or for repression or derepression. So the concept of epigenetics makes our life a little bit more complex, but makes it much more interesting. And I can't give you examples to say, yes, go eat broccoli, because we do know broccoli does repress and derepress genes. But I will say that for example, in the Hong study, which looked at the HLA SNPs, that the two SNPs that were found, they had done actually, in a small subset of the group, they had done methylation studies and found that although there were differences in the amount of methylation for these areas of the gene that would predispose or, because of the methylation subtype, decrease the chance of predisposition. So yes, absolutely exposures are important. I think the most classic allergy that we see that probably has to do with gene repression and derepression is shellfish allergy. Shellfish allergy is common, but it's not so common in children when the vast majority of food allergy is seen. And yet shellfish allergy is very common in individuals who've been eating shellfish for 20, 30, 40 years. And what would be a fascinating study, I'm a pediatrician, so it's harder for me to do, would be to look at the demethylation that takes place in certain areas that a virus or an antibiotic or a bacteria might do to lead to expression of the shellfish allergy gene in these individuals. The other area that we are working on actively is, and not just we, but all the groups that are looking at tolerance orally, is changes in methylation that are induced during oral tolerance when you are desensitizing someone to milk or to peanut or to egg. And that will be very elucidative and allow us to design things that may or may not be able to intervene earlier in life. So it's a fabulous question.
May I ask another question? You talked about, we know about children's allergy, but are there informations about change in susceptibility to allergens when you get older?
So, as a pediatrician, I talk a lot to my adult colleagues, and there still seems to be people who are allergic to certain families of foods. For example, as Dr. Taylor pointed out, the legume family. So we see a lot of change in time of broadening of sensitivity to legumes as people hit adolescence or adulthood. We also see decreases in allergy profile as people get older and as their immune systems mature and perhaps as they're exposed to things. So there's no hard and fast rule. I think that other than shellfish, there's no single area where people have been starting to develop allergies specifically as adults, but certainly I know in the area of tree nut allergy. There's more, because of the changes in North American diet, there's more cashew and pistachio allergy that's being developed as an adult in those who may have had a single tree nut allergy or even just peanut allergy, and certainly a broadening in the legume allergies.
Great.
Good morning. Chuck Barton, Valspar Corporation. Thank you all for very mentally stimulating and very educational talks this morning. I have a question in regards to children being exposed to various allergens at a very young age, infants, and then being protected against developing allergies later in life. I'm curious, I know that when a first child is born, usually the parents keep the baby in a bubble. By the second one, they don't, the kids can do mostly what he wants. By the third one, he can play in a mud pile all day. And the parents, they're like, whatever. And so I'm just wondering, is there a statistically increased number of people that are firstborn children that have allergies compared to the third?
So most of the cohorts that have looked longitudinally at families would say yes. And that probably was one of the first observations of the hygiene hypothesis that became of great interest in the 80s and really took off in the 90s and early 2000s. That the more clean your environment and the less exposure to bacteria and less exposure to viruses, which was particular among firstborn kids, especially those that weren't in daycare, seemed to have an increase in atopic disease. And as I said, in the health nut study and in European cohorts, the more siblings you have, the lower the more pressure you have on your immune system to be educated early, and therefore it seems to be protective. So yeah, have lots of kids and keep them dirty.
I caught my son drinking out of the bird bath twice. He's pretty good. Microbiota.
And hug your
Solid.
dog, right?
Right.
Yes.
Hug your dog.
Yes, hug our dog. All right, Tony.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for a very informative panel. My name is Tony Flood, Senior Director of Food Safety and Defense with the International Food Information Council, a communications organization. So I believe, Dr. Stallings, one of your comments at the beginning of your presentation included to educate and dispel myths about food allergy. Also, I believe I saw Dr. Taylor mention an opportunity to change sort of the misperceptions about food allergy. In our 24/7 world of news and media and environment that we live in, where a majority of consumers get their information from family and friends, government, and some health professionals, we've come to the belief that perception is reality. So a question that I might have as an opening question looking at education and communications, who do you think is the target audience that will be the most appropriate to educate and dispel the mess, and what are your recommendations to educate this audience? And as a follow-up, I just wanted to ask a leading question. Given the actors that are presented in the roadmap document, I see research, government, healthcare providers, industry, public health authorities, professional organizations, and educational institutions. Where are consumers on this list?
Thank you for that. I think as you have the opportunity to go through the whole report, each one of those has pages of sort of supporting documents. So one of the important messages is the committee does consider, and I think all of us would as individuals, that this is an underappreciated condition. And so to bring it to a public health platform is very important. Your question about to whom to address this, the easy answer is everybody. That's what you mean by a public health message. If you look at what we've done with smoking, with drinking and driving, I'm old enough to remember what happened when, anti-littering was, something that kids were taught that changed parent behavior. But it really is something because eating is done all of the time, everywhere. An understanding of this would be helpful. when we heard from our parents and advocacy group stakeholders, this issue of misconceptions and bias and in some elements, disregard that this could be a life-threatening illness to that child or that person, came through loud and clear. So I think we all have an opportunity to do this. We do have more evidence now about that it exists, the prevalence and that sort of thing. But it was astounding. I'm very accustomed to working in a medical environment and disease and what people think about diseases. And they're diseases that have social stigma or are not socially appreciated. And this is sort of in there. Now, you may have called attention to potentially a design fault on that paragraph, on that thing, but I think if you go through the report, time and time again, it's about educating the patient, and when the patient is a child, making sure we do good transition through adolescence and young adulthood, and educating families, but also educating the doctors and the nurses and the dietitians, the techs, the school teachers, not just the school nurse, who probably does understand this. So they're just opportunity after opportunity, I think, but with basic facts and with basic first aid. I expect my colleagues to know, not my friends, to know basic CPR and how to do a Heimlich maneuver. I would like my friends to know if it looked like somebody was having a food allergy, if there were an auto injector handy, not to be afraid to use it. It's a good Samaritan kind of act. So globally, that's the kind of process we were recommending happen over the next few years and with the right players.
Thank you. Yeah, we have time for a couple more questions. Courtney?
Well, good morning. I'm Courtney Bidney from General Mills. Really appreciate the talk. This is a topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts. I'm curious, relative to the threshold discussion, what impact you think FSMA will have, or any discussions relative to FSMA and thresholds that you could share?
Well, I was kind of hopeful when the Food Safety Modernization Act was passed that FDA would have to establish reference doses in order to have effective preventive allergen controls. How do you know whether it's clean enough unless you have a reference dose? But I don't see a whole lot of movement in that regard. FDA, in some individuals within FDA seem to be open to the concept of thresholds and reference doses and see the value, but there seems to be a great deal of resistance within the organization to moving forward. I actually think it will be likely that the first movement will occur in some country other than the United States. I currently view the U.S. as one of the most conservative in that regard. We have better opportunities in Europe now, even though I would view them as very precautionary. They seem to be almost ready to go. And I won't reveal why I said that because it's too sensitive at the moment.